The thing about being the family disappointment is that eventually you stop feeling disappointed and start feeling something else entirely. For me, that something else had been building for about 3 years. And last Saturday at Marcus's graduation party, it finally reached the point where I was ready to act. Let me back up because this didn't start at the graduation. This started when I was 23 and got laid off from my first real job out of college. I'd been working in IT support for a mid-sized firm, nothing glamorous, but it paid decently. The layoffs hit our department hard, and I was one of the casualties. I moved back home because my lease was ending anyway. I figured I'd save money while I looked for something new. That was supposed to be temporary, 3 months tops. My parents had a different reaction than I expected. Earl, my dad, worked in insurance sales his whole life and always measured success by how much money you made and what title you had. Paula, my mom, taught elementary school but retired early due to some health issues with her back. They'd always been big on appearances, the kind of people who cared deeply about what the neighbors thought and how things looked to extended family. When I moved back in, they made it clear this was a mark of failure on my part. Marcus, my younger brother, had just started his first year of medical school, 23 years old and already on track to be a doctor. Josie, my sister, was finishing her accounting degree and had a job lined up at a decent firm. And then there was me, the oldest, living in the basement and sending out resumes that went nowhere. Here's what nobody knew, or maybe they knew and didn't care. About 6 months after I moved back, I landed a remote position doing software development for a tech company. The pay was actually really good, significantly better than my previous job. I could have moved out immediately, but I didn't. I stayed in that basement and I let them think I was still unemployed, still failing, still their biggest disappointment. Every time Earl made a comment about me needing to get my life together, I just nodded. Every time Paula sighed and said she didn't know where they went wrong with me, I agreed that I needed to do better. Meanwhile, I was making close to 6 figures and saving almost all of it because I barely had any expenses. I paid them some rent, not much, and I covered my own food and necessities. The rest went into savings and investments. By the time Marcus's graduation rolled around 3 years later, I had a substantial amount put away, and I'd been planning exactly how this was going to go down. The graduation party was at their house, the same house I'd grown up in. It's a decent 4-bedroom place in a middle-class neighborhood. Nothing fancy but respectable. Paula had been planning this party for weeks, making sure everything was perfect for her golden child. Marcus had just finished his 3rd year of med school and was heading into his 4th, which meant he was closer to becoming an actual doctor. This was a big deal for them. The party had about 40 people, mostly family and some of Marcus's friends from high school and med school. Josie was there with her fiancé Ruby, some guy she'd been dating for 2 years who worked in finance. Extended family filled out the rest of the crowd, aunts and uncles and cousins who I saw maybe twice a year. I'd already decided what I was going to do before I even showed up. I'd given my notice at my remote job 2 weeks earlier, explaining I was relocating for personal reasons. I'd already signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment across town, a nice place that I'd be moving into the following week. I'd set up automatic transfers to move my money out of the joint account I still had with my parents from when I was younger, the one they'd insisted on keeping active for emergencies. That joint account had become something they used regularly over the past few years. I'd noticed charges for their mortgage payment coming out of it, their car insurance, utilities, various bills. At some point, they'd started treating it like their personal account, even though my name was on it and I was the one who'd been funding it. The kicker was that I'd been the one paying those bills through that account for the past 2 years, without them explicitly asking. It started small. I'd transfer money in to cover something they mentioned they were short on, and then it just became expected. They never thanked me, never acknowledged it, because officially, I was still the unemployed loser in the basement. Acknowledging I was paying their bills would have meant acknowledging I wasn't actually failing. So I showed up to this party knowing exactly what was coming and knowing exactly what I was going to do about it. I wore jeans and a regular t-shirt. Nothing special, because that's what was expected of me. Marcus was in a button-down and slacks, looking every bit the successful med student. Josie had on some dress that probably cost more than my entire outfit. I grabbed a beer from the cooler and hung around the edges of the party, waiting. The toast started around 7. Earl stood up first with his beer raised, talking about how proud he was of Marcus, how he'd always known Marcus would do great things, how medical school was just the beginning of an incredible career. Standard proud parent stuff. Then Paula stood up, and I saw her glance at me before she started talking. That's when I knew it was coming. She clinked her glass to get everyone's attention and started off nice enough, talking about Marcus's achievements and his dedication. Then she pivoted. She said something about how grateful she was that Marcus had shown them what success looked like, that he'd given them hope after their first attempt hadn't quite worked out the way they'd planned. People laughed a little. That uncomfortable laughter when you're not sure if it's a joke or not. Then she went further. She said, "Let's all thank our oldest for showing us what failure looks like so we could raise a winner this time." She said it with a smile, like it was playful teasing, but the words hit exactly how she meant them to hit. The room laughed. That same uncomfortable laughter, but louder now. Because if the parent is saying it, then it must be okay to laugh along. Earl jumped in before the laughter died down. He said one kid in med school, one kid still finding himself at 26. Guess which one still lives in the basement? More laughter. Someone whooped. Marcus looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. Josie rolled her eyes at me like I was dirt on her shoe, like my presence at this party was an embarrassment she had to endure. I smiled. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and pretended it was vibrating. I looked at the screen like I'd gotten an important message, and then I stood up. I said I had to take this call and walked out the back door into the yard. I kept walking, straight through the yard to the side gate, through the gate to my car parked on the street. I drove to my basement entrance, packed up everything I owned in about 90 minutes, loaded it into my car in a small trailer I'd rented earlier that week. I left my key to the basement door on the kitchen counter, upstairs with no note. Then I drove to my new apartment and started unloading. While I was unloading, I pulled up my banking app and executed the transfers I'd already set up. Every dollar came out of that joint account into my personal account. Then I called the bank and had myself removed as a joint account holder. The account stayed open, but now it was only in their names, and it had a balance of about $47 because that's all they'd contributed to it in recent memory. I also canceled the automatic payments I'd set up for their mortgage, their car insurance, and their utilities. All of that had been coming from my personal account with me as the payer. I wasn't breaking any laws, I wasn't stealing anything, I was just stopping the voluntary payments I'd been making. They'd have to cover those bills themselves now, which they absolutely could do if they budgeted properly. Earl still worked full-time and Paula had her pension from teaching. They'd just gotten comfortable having me subsidize their lifestyle while simultaneously treating me like garbage. The next morning, Sunday, my phone started blowing up. Texts from Paula asking where I was. Texts from Earl saying we needed to talk. Texts from Josie saying I'd ruined Marcus's party by leaving early. I didn't respond to any of them. I spent Sunday organizing my apartment and getting settled in. Monday morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls. I listened to one voicemail from Earl, and it was him saying the bank had called him about insufficient funds for their mortgage payment, and what did I do? His tone wasn't concerned or confused, it was angry, like I'd done something wrong by taking my money out of an account with my name on it. Monday evening, around 6, someone started pounding on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw all 4 of them standing there. Earl, Paula, Marcus, and Josie. Earl was red in the face and Paula looked like she'd been crying. Marcus looked uncomfortable and Josie looked furious. They were shouting through the door. "We need to talk. The bank said you pulled everything. You're destroying your own family." Earl was saying I was being childish and spiteful. Paula was saying she couldn't believe I would do this to them over a harmless joke. Josie was saying I was pathetic for holding a grudge over some teasing. I stood there on the other side of the door looking through the peephole at them, and I didn't feel guilty at all. I felt calm. I felt ready. Because this wasn't a reaction, this was the plan, and it was going exactly how I'd known it would go. They kept pounding, and eventually, a neighbor opened their door and asked if everything was okay. That's when they left, but not before Earl shouted through the door that this wasn't over and I'd better answer my phone when he called. I went back to my couch and opened my laptop. I had a job interview scheduled for Wednesday with a company that had reached out to me on LinkedIn, a better position than the one I'd just left, and I needed to prepare. My phone kept buzzing with texts and calls, but I muted it and focused on what mattered. 3 years I'd lived in that basement. 3 years I'd let them think I was failing while I built up my savings and my career. 3 years of comments and jokes and being treated like I was less than. And now they were at my door, panicking because the money they'd taken for granted was gone. This was just the beginning, and they had no idea what was coming next. Update 1. So that interview I mentioned? Got the job. Started Tuesday, which was literally the day after my family showed up banging on my door. The position is senior developer, fully remote, and pays 30% more than what I was making before. Just wanted to lead with that because some of you said I should focus on my career and not on revenge, but here's the thing. I can do both. Tuesday morning, I had 3 voicemails from Earl. I listened to them while I was setting up my home office in my new apartment. The first one was him saying we needed to have a mature conversation about this situation I'd created. The second one was him saying I was being unreasonable and they deserved an explanation. The third one was him saying fine, if I wanted to play games, he knew where I worked and he'd show up there if he had to. That last one made me laugh because he thought I still worked at that IT support job from 3 years ago. He had no idea what I actually did for work or where I worked or how much I made. He'd never asked. None of them had asked. For 3 years, I'd lived in their basement and they never once asked what I did all day on my laptop or how I paid for anything. I decided to call him back because I wasn't trying to avoid them, I just wanted them to sweat a little first. He answered on the first ring and immediately started in about how I'd screwed them over, and they needed that money back in the account immediately. I asked him which money he meant. He said the money I took from their account. I corrected him and said it was our joint account, emphasis on joint, and I was legally entitled to remove my own money whenever I wanted. He switched tactics. He said, okay, fine. Technically, it was my money, but they'd been depending on it, and I knew that. They had bills to pay, and I'd left them in a terrible position. I asked him what bills specifically he was worried about. He listed off the mortgage, the car insurance, the electric bill, the water bill. I said that's interesting because those are all things that adults normally pay for themselves, and he was what, 62 years old, maybe time to figure out how to manage a budget. That's when he really lost it. He said I was being a selfish brat, and I had no idea what they'd sacrificed for me growing up. He said they'd raised me and fed me and put a roof over my head, and this was how I repaid them. I said actually, they'd done the bare minimum required by law for a child they chose to have. And as for the roof over my head, I'd been paying rent for 3 years, so that argument didn't really land. Paula got on the phone. She was crying, doing that thing where she could barely get words out between sobs. She said she couldn't believe I was doing this to them over a joke, that she'd been teasing me the way mothers tease their sons, that I was too sensitive and always had been. She said they loved me, and they were proud of me, even if they didn't always show it the right way. I asked her to name one thing about my life that she was proud of. Anything at all. She went quiet for a second and then said she was proud that I was finally getting myself together and looking for work. I told her I'd had a job for 3 years. She didn't believe me. She said if I had a job, why was I living in their basement? I said because I was saving money while simultaneously paying most of their bills, apparently. She started crying harder and said I was making things up to justify abandoning them. She said I'd always been difficult, even as a child, always questioning things and never just accepting how things were. She said Marcus and Josie had always been easier, more agreeable, more willing to see their perspective. That's when something clicked for me. She'd just admitted it. The reason they treated me differently wasn't because I was actually failing at life, it was because I didn't play along with their narrative. Marcus went to med school because that's what they wanted and it made them look good. Josie got her accounting degree and got engaged to some finance guy because that fit their image of success. I'd chosen my own path and they'd never forgiven me for it. I asked Paula point blank why she said those things at the party. She said, what things? I said the failure comment, the winner comment, all of it. She said she was just trying to motivate me, that sometimes people need tough love to get moving. I said no. She was trying to humiliate me in front of 40 people to make Marcus look better by comparison. And it had worked. Everyone laughed right on cue. She denied it. She said I was twisting her words and she'd meant it lightheartedly. I said if it was so lighthearted, why was Earl adding his own jab about the basement? She said Earl was just joining in on the fun and I needed to stop being so sensitive. I told her I had to go and hung up. Within 5 minutes, Josie was calling. I almost didn't answer, but I was curious what angle she'd take. Turns out she was furious with me for a completely different reason than I expected. Her wedding was in 8 months and apparently Earl and Paula had been planning to contribute $15,000 to help pay for it. Now they were saying they couldn't afford it because I'd taken their money. I asked Josie how much she knew about their financial situation. She said she knew enough. She knew they had bills to pay, and I'd suddenly decided to stop helping out of spite. I asked if she knew who'd been paying those bills. She said obviously they had. I asked if she'd ever wondered how they afforded everything on Earl's sales income and Paula's pension. She said that wasn't her business, and besides, they were her parents, and parents take care of their kids. I said sure, when the kids are actually kids, but she was 28 and getting married, and maybe it was time to fund her own wedding. She said I was being cruel and jealous because I didn't have anyone in my life. She said I'd always been bitter about Marcus and her being more successful. She said the least I could do was help them help her since I clearly had money if I could afford to move out. I asked her if she remembered what Paula said at the party. She said, yeah, it was a joke and I needed to get over it. I said, did you laugh? She said, what? I said when Mom called me a failure and Dad made the basement joke, did you laugh? She went quiet. I said I saw you roll your eyes at me like I was trash, so don't call me now, asking for money for your wedding. She said she rolled her eyes because I always make everything about me and she wanted the focus to stay on Marcus. I said the focus was on Marcus until our parents decided to roast me for entertainment. She said I left the party early and made a scene by walking out. I said I left after being publicly humiliated and nobody stopped me or checked if I was okay. So maybe examine that. She hung up on me. 2 hours later, Marcus called. This was Wednesday afternoon, and I was in the middle of onboarding for my new job, but I took the call because I wanted to hear what he had to say. Marcus had always been the quietest of the three of us, kind of passive. Went along with whatever everyone else wanted. He said he felt bad about what happened at the party. He said he didn't laugh when they made those comments, and he was uncomfortable the whole time. I asked him if he said anything to them about it. He said no because it was his party, and he didn't want to make things awkward. I said it was already awkward. They just humiliated their oldest son in front of everyone, but he'd chosen not to rock the boat. He said he understood why I was upset, but he was calling because Earl and Paula had told him they might not be able to keep paying his tuition. See, Marcus had some scholarships and loans, but Earl and Paula had been covering a significant portion of his medical school costs. Apparently that money had been coming from somewhere and now it wasn't going to be available. He asked if there was any way we could work this out. He said he only had 1 more year left and if they couldn't pay, he'd have to take out massive loans that would bury him in debt. I asked him how much they'd been paying per semester. He said around $20,000. I asked where he thought they were getting $20,000 twice a year. He said he didn't know. He assumed they'd been saving. I told him they hadn't been saving. They'd been using my money. That joint account I'd been funding had been covering not just their bills, but also his tuition payments. He didn't believe me at first. He said that didn't make sense. Why would they use my money without telling me? I said, great question, maybe ask them. He got defensive. He said even if that was true, I should have talked to them before just pulling everything out. He said I'd put him in a terrible position over a stupid comment at a party. I said the comment wasn't the issue, the years of disrespect and the financial exploitation were the issue, but interesting that he thought his tuition was more important than them calling me a failure in front of 40 people. He said he needed that degree and I was being vindictive. I said he was 26 years old and had taken out loans before. He'd figure it out. He said I was punishing him for something Earl and Paula did. I said no. I was stopping paying for his education without his knowledge or consent, which was apparently what I'd been doing all along. Thursday morning, I got a call from Earl's brother Colton. Uncle Colton lived 2 states away and I barely knew him. Saw him maybe once every few years. He said Earl had called him asking to borrow money, and he wanted to know what was going on. I gave him the short version. He said that sounded like Earl. Always terrible with money, always living beyond his means. This was news to me. Colton said Earl had borrowed money from family members multiple times over the years and rarely paid it back. He said when they bought the house 15 years ago, it was more expensive than they could afford, but Paula had insisted on that neighborhood. He said they'd been struggling financially for as long as he could remember. I asked why nobody had mentioned this to me. Colton said it wasn't really something the family talked about openly, and besides, he figured I knew since I lived there. He said Earl had called him asking for a loan to cover their mortgage and car payment for a few months, saying his son had screwed him over financially and he just needed some help getting back on his feet. Colton had said no. He told Earl that maybe this was a wake-up call to get his finances in order. Then he'd called me to get the real story. I appreciated that. We talked for about 20 minutes, and he said good for me for finally standing up to them. He said they'd been using Marcus as their trophy and Josie as their perfect daughter and treating me like their disappointment for too long. Thursday afternoon, Earl showed up at my apartment building again. The front desk called up and asked if I wanted to see him. I said yes because I wanted to have this conversation face to face. I met him in the lobby, not taking him up to my apartment. He looked exhausted. He said they were going to lose the house if I didn't help them. He said the mortgage payment was due and they didn't have it. He said they'd tried to get a loan, but their credit wasn't great and nobody would approve them on short notice. I asked whose fault that was. He said it was complicated and I wouldn't understand. I said try me. He said they'd made some financial decisions over the years that hadn't worked out. They'd refinanced the house twice to pay off credit card debt. They'd taken out loans for Marcus's undergrad that they'd barely been paying the minimums on. They'd been living paycheck to paycheck for years, and my money had been the thing keeping them afloat. I asked him why he never told me any of this. He said because it was embarrassing and he didn't want me to know how bad things had gotten. I said so instead. You let me pay your bills without telling me while simultaneously calling me a failure. He said he never called me a failure. That was just Paula joking around. I stared at him. He actually tried to stand by that. I asked him what he wanted from me. He said he wanted me to put the money back and we could pretend this never happened. I said that wasn't going to happen. He said then they'd lose the house and it would be my fault. I said no. It would be the fault of two adults who'd spent decades living beyond their means and treating their son like garbage while stealing from him. He said stealing was a strong word. I said, what would you call using someone's money without their knowledge or permission? He said it was a family account and family helps family. I said family doesn't humiliate family at parties for laughs. We stood there in the lobby and he tried every angle. He tried guilt, saying I was destroying them. He tried anger, saying I was being petty and vindictive. He tried bargaining, saying if I helped them this one time, they'd pay me back. I didn't budge on any of it. Finally, he said they were going to have to sell the house. He said they'd been in that house for 15 years and it would kill Paula to leave. I said maybe they should have thought about that before using me as a punchline. He left after that. My phone has been blowing up since then with texts from various family members who've apparently heard different versions of what's happening. Some of them think I'm being unreasonable. Some of them think Earl and Paula had it coming. It's created this whole family divide that's spreading beyond just my immediate family. And here's the thing. I don't feel bad about any of it. They're scrambling and panicking and trying to figure out how to survive without my money. And I'm sitting in my new apartment with my new job making more money than I ever have. And I'm watching it all unfold exactly like I knew it would. The question is, what happens next because they're clearly not going to just accept this and move on. Update 2. The family group chat exploded over the weekend. I'm not in it anymore because I left it Friday morning, but Colton forwarded me screenshots because he thought I should see what was being said about me. Paula had posted a long message about how I'd abandoned them in their time of need and how family was supposed to stick together through hard times. Multiple aunts and cousins commented with supportive messages for her. A few people asked what actually happened. Paula's version was that I'd moved out suddenly and taken money that they'd been counting on for bills, and now they were facing foreclosure. Nobody mentioned the graduation party. Nobody mentioned what they'd said about me. It was all framed as me being vindictive and cruel for no reason. Saturday afternoon, Josie showed up at my apartment with Ruby. I was surprised the front desk let them up, but apparently Josie told them she was my sister and it was a family emergency. I opened the door and she pushed past me into my living room. Ruby followed, looking uncomfortable. Josie started talking immediately. She said we needed to discuss the wedding situation because she'd put deposits down on venues and catering and a bunch of other things based on Earl and Paula's promise to contribute. She said those deposits were non-refundable and she couldn't afford to lose that money. She said if they couldn't pay their share, she'd have to scale everything back and it would ruin the wedding she'd been planning. I asked how much she'd put down in deposits. She said about $8,000. I asked if Earl and Paula had actually given her any money yet or just promised it. She said they'd promised it and she'd trusted them. I said that was her first mistake, trusting them with money. Ruby tried to intervene. He said maybe we could all calm down and figure out a solution that worked for everyone. I asked what he thought a fair solution looked like. He said maybe I could loan Earl and Paula enough to get caught up on their bills, and then they could contribute to the wedding like they'd promised. I asked why I would loan money to people who'd spent 3 years using me as their personal ATM without telling me. Josie said it wasn't about them. It was about her. She said she'd done nothing wrong, and she was being punished for their mistakes. I said she'd rolled her eyes at me at the party and then laughed along with everyone else. So maybe she had done something wrong. She said she didn't laugh. I said, fine, you didn't laugh. But you didn't defend me either, and now you want me to fund your wedding. She started crying. Not the manipulative crying like Paula does. Actual frustrated tears. She said she'd worked hard to build a relationship with Earl and Paula that was different from mine. She said she'd played by their rules and done what they wanted, and now she was finally getting something she wanted and I was ruining it. That's when something clicked for me. I asked her what she meant by playing by their rules. She wiped her eyes and said I'd always fought with them about everything. What I wanted to study, what jobs I took, where I lived, who I dated, all of it. She said I'd made everything difficult by refusing to just go along with what they thought was best. She said she'd learned to just agree with them, and life was easier that way. I asked if she actually wanted to marry Ruby or if that was part of playing by the rules too. Ruby looked shocked. Josie said of course she wanted to marry him. What kind of question was that? I said I was just wondering if she'd picked him because he had the right job and the right background and fit their image of what a son-in-law should be. Ruby said maybe he should wait in the car. Josie told him to stay. Then she turned back to me and said I was being cruel and trying to ruin her relationship now too. I said I wasn't trying to ruin anything. I was just pointing out that she'd spent her entire adult life doing what Earl and Paula wanted instead of what she wanted, and maybe that's why they liked her better than me. She said they didn't like her better. They just respected her more because she respected them. I said they called me a failure at a party in front of 40 people, so clearly they had a preference. She said if I'd just gotten a real job and moved out years ago instead of living in their basement, they wouldn't have said those things. I told her I had a real job. She said when? I said for 3 years. She didn't believe me. She said if that was true, why didn't I tell anyone? I said because I wanted to see how long they'd keep treating me like garbage while I paid their bills. She said that was manipulative and weird. Ruby spoke up. He said maybe there was blame on both sides and we should focus on moving forward. I asked him how much he was contributing to the wedding. He said they were splitting costs evenly. I asked how much that was. He said about $25,000 each. I said so Josie needs Earl and Paula's $15,000 to cover her half. He nodded. I asked Josie if she'd considered just having a smaller wedding that she could actually afford. She said this was her wedding, and she'd been planning it for 2 years and she shouldn't have to compromise because I decided to throw a tantrum. I said I didn't throw a tantrum. I removed myself from an abusive situation and stopped letting them use my money. She said abusive was dramatic. I asked what she'd call it when your parents publicly humiliate you for entertainment and then steal from you for years. She said they didn't steal. It was a shared account. I said shared means both parties know what's happening and agree to it. She said I should have paid more attention to my own accounts then. We went in circles for another 20 minutes. She tried guilt, saying I was her brother and I should want her to be happy. She tried anger, saying I was selfish and only thought about myself. She tried bargaining, saying if I helped with the wedding, she'd talk to Earl and Paula about apologizing. I said no to all of it. Before they left, Josie said she hoped I knew I was destroying the family. I said the family destroyed itself a long time ago. I just stopped pretending it was okay. She slammed my door on the way out. Sunday morning, Marcus showed up. Just him, no one else. He looked like he hadn't slept much. He said he'd spent the weekend running numbers and talking to financial aid, and he couldn't make the tuition work without Earl and Paula's help. He said he'd have to take out private loans at terrible interest rates that would take him 20 years to pay off. I asked if he'd talked to them about where their money had been coming from. He said yes, and Earl had admitted they'd been using funds from the joint account for his tuition. Marcus said he felt terrible about it, that he hadn't known, that if he'd known he would have taken out loans instead. I asked him why he didn't defend me at the party. He said he didn't know what to say. I said how about anything? How about telling them to stop or asking if I was okay or literally any acknowledgement that what they were doing was wrong? He said he froze up and by the time he thought about saying something, I'd already left. He asked if there was any way we could work something out. He said he'd pay me back after he became a doctor. I asked when that would be. He said he had 1 more year of med school and then 3 to 7 years of residency depending on his specialty. So at minimum 4 years, more likely 8. I said that's a long time to wait for money I already earned. He said he understood, but he was desperate. He said this was his future and his career, and he'd worked too hard to quit now. I said nobody was asking him to quit just to fund his own education like millions of other people do. He said I didn't understand the pressure he was under. He said Earl and Paula had been pushing him toward medical school since high school. He said they'd made it clear that was the only acceptable path, and anything else would be a disappointment. He said he'd gone along with it because he didn't want to be treated like I was treated. That was honest, at least. I asked him if he even wanted to be a doctor. He said he thought so, but sometimes he wasn't sure if it was what he wanted or what they wanted. I said that sounded like a personal problem he needed to figure out. He got frustrated. He said I was being vindictive and punishing him for things Earl and Paula did. I said no. I was just not paying for his education anymore, which I'd been doing without knowing it. He said the result was the same. I was screwing him over. I said, welcome to how I've felt for 3 years. We talked for another hour. He tried every angle Marcus could try, which wasn't much because Marcus has never been good at confrontation. Eventually, he left without getting what he wanted. Monday afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a woman named Helen, who identified herself as Earl's sister. I'd met her maybe twice in my entire life at family gatherings. She said she'd heard what was going on and she wanted to offer to mediate. She said she'd talked to Earl and Paula, and they were willing to sit down and have a conversation if I was. I asked what kind of conversation. She said one where everyone could air their grievances and try to find a path forward. I said I'd already aired my grievances and the path forward was them figuring out their own finances. She said families were complicated, and sometimes people said things they didn't mean. I said those people said exactly what they meant. They just didn't expect consequences. Helen said she understood I was hurt, but destroying them financially wasn't going to make me feel better. I said I wasn't destroying them. I was removing myself as their source of income. She said the effect was the same. I said no, the effect was they had to live within their actual means like normal adults. She asked if I'd be willing to meet with them just once with her there. She said she'd make sure it stayed civil and everyone got to speak. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to hear what they'd say with a mediator present. Part of me knew it would just be more manipulation. I told Helen I'd think about it. She said to call her back by end of week if I wanted to set something up. I haven't called her back yet. Tuesday evening, Earl and Paula showed up at my building again. This time the front desk didn't let them up, but they called to ask if I wanted to come down. I said no. The desk person said they were asking to just speak to me for 5 minutes. I said tell them to leave, or I'd call the police for harassment. Paula got on the lobby phone. She was crying again. She said they were going to lose the house and it was really happening. She said they'd missed the mortgage payment and the bank had sent them a notice of default. She said they had 30 days to catch up or the foreclosure process would start. She said please, just this once, help them get current. And they'd never ask for anything again. I asked her if she remembered what she said at the party. She said she'd apologized for that. I said no, she hadn't. She said she'd explained it was meant as a joke. I said an explanation isn't an apology, and a joke is only funny if everyone's laughing. She said she was sorry, okay? She was sorry for what she said and how she said it. She said she'd been drinking and trying to be funny and it came out wrong. I asked how many drinks it took for her real feelings to come out. She started crying harder. Earl got back on the phone. He said I'd made my point and proven I could hurt them, but now it was time to be the bigger person. I said I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was protecting myself from people who'd been hurting me for years. He said I was exaggerating and being dramatic. I said he could believe whatever he wanted, but I wasn't giving them any money. He said they'd raised me, and I owed them. I said they'd done the legally required minimum for a child they chose to have, and I didn't owe them anything beyond what I'd already given, which was 3 years of paying their bills while they mocked me. He said if the house went into foreclosure, it would ruin their credit and they'd never recover. I said maybe they should have thought of that before refinancing twice to pay off credit cards. The desk person told them they had to leave. Earl said this wasn't over. I hung up. Wednesday, I got a Facebook message from Josie saying Ruby had called off the wedding. Not permanently, just postponed it because they couldn't afford the wedding they'd planned without Earl and Paula's contribution, and Josie was refusing to scale back. She said this was my fault and she'd never forgive me. I didn't respond. Thursday, Uncle Colton called again. He said the family was splitting into factions and it was getting ugly. He said some people were saying I should help Earl and Paula because they're family, and you don't let family become homeless. He said other people were saying Earl and Paula had this coming, and they'd been financially irresponsible for decades. He said Earl's brothers were being asked to loan money, and they were all saying no because they'd been burned before. He said Paula's sister had offered to let them move in with her temporarily, but they'd refused because they were too proud. He said they were still holding out hope that I'd change my mind. I asked Colton what he thought I should do. He said that wasn't his place to say, but if it was him, he wouldn't give them a dime. He said Earl had borrowed $5,000 from him 8 years ago and never paid it back, and he'd learned his lesson about lending money to family who couldn't manage their own finances. Friday morning, I got a text from Marcus saying he'd made a decision. He'd talked to his medical school about taking a year off to work and save money for his final year. He said it would delay everything, but it was better than drowning in private loan debt. He said he hoped I was happy that I'd derailed his entire career over a grudge. I texted back that his career wasn't derailed, just delayed. And it wasn't over a grudge. It was about boundaries and self-respect. He didn't respond. The house stuff is moving forward whether they want it to or not. Colton sent me a screenshot of a Facebook post Paula made about how heartbroken she was to be losing their family home. Dozens of comments from people offering sympathy and asking what happened. Her responses were vague, but clearly painted me as the villain. I'm not changing my mind. They're scrambling and trying everything they can think of to get me to fold. But I've been planning this for too long, and I meant what I said about boundaries. The question now is how far they'll go when they realize I'm serious. Final update. The mediation meeting with Helen happened. I didn't want to do it, but Colton convinced me it might be worth hearing what they had to say with a witness present who could confirm later that I'd been reasonable and they'd been exactly who I knew they were. Helen arranged for us to meet at a park near my apartment on Saturday afternoon. Neutral ground, public place, no one's home territory. I showed up 15 minutes early and sat at a picnic table near the parking lot. Earl and Paula arrived exactly on time with Helen. Marcus and Josie came separately, which I hadn't expected but should have. Helen started by setting ground rules. Everyone would get a chance to speak without interruption. We'd focus on finding solutions rather than rehashing grievances. We'd all try to approach this from a place of family love and mutual respect. I almost laughed at that last one, but I kept my face neutral. Earl went first. He'd clearly prepared what he wanted to say. He talked about how they'd raised 3 children and done their best with the resources they had. He said sometimes they'd made mistakes with money, but they'd always prioritized their kids' needs. He said the joint account situation had been a misunderstanding, and if I'd just communicated with them about my concerns, they could have worked something out. I asked what there was to misunderstand about using someone's money without telling them. He said it was a joint account, so technically, it was their money too. I said he'd contributed $47 to that account in 3 years, so that math didn't work. He said I was being pedantic and missing the bigger picture. Paula went next. She was calmer than I'd seen her in weeks, probably because Helen was there. She said she loved all her children equally, and she'd never meant to make me feel less than. She said the comments at Marcus's party had been her attempt at humor, and she took full responsibility for how they'd landed. She said she was sorry I'd been hurt, and she wanted to rebuild our relationship. I asked if she was sorry for what she said or sorry that I'd reacted to what she said. She said both. I said those are two different things, and only one of them is an actual apology. Helen tried to redirect, but I said no, this is important, because if she's sorry I was hurt, but not sorry for hurting me, then we're still at the same place we've always been. Paula said she was sorry for both. She was sorry for what she said and how it affected me. I asked why she said it in the first place. She said she'd thought it would be motivating, that sometimes people need a push to get moving in the right direction. I said I'd had a job for 3 years and been paying most of their bills, so what exactly did she think I needed motivation to do? That's when it got interesting. Paula said she hadn't known I had a job. Earl said they'd assumed I was doing freelance work or something part-time. I asked why they assumed that instead of just asking me. Paula said I'd always been private about my life and they'd respected my boundaries. I said that's interesting because they'd felt comfortable using my money without respecting that boundary. Josie spoke up. She said everyone had made mistakes and we needed to focus on moving forward. She said the wedding was postponed because of this situation and she wanted her family intact for when they rescheduled. She said she understood I was angry, but holding grudges only hurt everyone involved, including me. I asked Josie if she'd known where Earl and Paula were getting the money for her wedding contribution. She said no. I asked if she'd ever wondered how they could afford to contribute $15,000 when Earl had worked in sales at the same company for 20 years and Paula was on a teacher's pension. She said she'd assumed they'd been saving. I said, did you actually assume that, or did you just not want to know the answer? She got defensive. She said she wasn't responsible for their financial decisions. I said, but you were happy to benefit from them. She said that wasn't fair. I said, you're right. It's not fair. None of this has been fair for 3 years. Marcus had been quiet the whole time. Helen asked if he wanted to say anything. He said he'd decided to take the year off from medical school like he'd mentioned. He said he'd be working full-time and saving money and he'd finish his degree when he could afford it. He said he was angry at everyone, at Earl and Paula for putting him in this position, at me for not being willing to help, at himself for not figuring any of this out sooner. I asked him if he understood why I wasn't helping. He said he understood I was hurt and wanted them to face consequences, but he was facing consequences too for something he didn't do. I said he'd benefited from something he didn't know about, which was me paying his tuition through that joint account, and now that benefit was gone. He said it felt like punishment. I said it was reality. Earl tried to steer things back to the house situation. He said they'd received another notice from the bank, and they had less than 3 weeks to bring the mortgage current or the foreclosure would proceed. He said they'd applied for hardship assistance and been denied. They'd tried to refinance and couldn't qualify. They'd looked into reverse mortgages and didn't meet the requirements. They were out of options. Paula said they'd started packing. She said they'd found a 2-bedroom apartment they could afford with Earl's salary and her pension. She said they'd be moving in 2 months whether the foreclosure completed or not because they couldn't make the next mortgage payment either. She said losing the house was killing her because it held all their memories of raising us kids. I asked where those memories were when she called me a failure in front of 40 people. She said she'd apologized for that. I said no. You'd explained it. You'd justified it. You'd minimized it. But you hadn't actually apologized in a way that showed you understood what you'd done. Helen interrupted. She said we were getting stuck in the past and we needed to focus on solutions. She asked what would need to happen for me to consider helping them financially. I said nothing could happen because I wasn't considering it. She asked why I'd agreed to this meeting then. I said because Colton asked me to and I wanted it on record that I'd tried to talk to them like adults. Earl said I was being stubborn and prideful. I said I was being consistent with the boundaries I'd set. Paula said boundaries were fine, but you also had to consider compassion and family loyalty. I said they hadn't considered those things when they were using my money and mocking me, so why should I consider them now? Josie said I was being vindictive and cruel. I said I was being protective of myself and my resources. Marcus said he just wanted everyone to stop fighting. Helen said maybe we should take a break and reconvene in a few days. I said there was no point in reconvening because my answer wasn't going to change. We argued in circles for another 40 minutes. Earl tried threatening legal action, saying he'd sue me for the money they'd counted on from the joint account. I told him to go ahead and try, that I'd hire a lawyer and we could let a judge decide if he had any claim to money I'd earned and deposited. He backed down. Paula tried emotional manipulation, talking about how much they'd sacrificed for me growing up, how they'd gone without things so I could have what I needed. I asked for specifics. She couldn't provide any. I said that's because you didn't sacrifice, you did the bare minimum required by law, and then complained about it. Josie tried bargaining, saying if I helped them save the house, she'd make sure they paid me back over time. I said I didn't want their money. I wanted them to understand what they'd done. She said I was being impossible. I said I was being clear. Marcus didn't try anything. He just sat there looking exhausted and defeated. And I felt bad about that for about 30 seconds before I remembered that he'd watched them humiliate me at his party and said nothing. The meeting ended with nothing resolved. Helen said she'd tried, and she was sorry it hadn't worked out. Earl said I'd regret this when they were gone and I had no family left. Paula said she hoped I'd find happiness even though I'd chosen anger instead. Josie said she was done trying with me. Marcus said nothing. I went back to my apartment and ordered takeout and watched a movie. My phone stayed quiet for the first time in 2 weeks. The foreclosure is moving forward. Colton sent me the listing when it went up on the real estate site. They're asking more than it's worth given the condition and location, but that's not my problem. Paula posted on Facebook about it with some long caption about how sometimes life throws you curveballs and you have to adapt. The comments were mostly supportive, but I noticed a few people asking questions she wasn't answering. Marcus registered for classes for next fall after his year off. He found a job doing medical transcription remotely, which pays decent and looks good on his resume. He's moved in with 2 roommates from med school to split costs. He unfriended me on social media but didn't block me. Josie and Ruby set a new wedding date for next year. The new plan is a much smaller wedding at a restaurant with immediate family only. She blocked me on everything. Paula made a Facebook post about being excited for the intimate celebration. No mention of me not being invited because that would require acknowledging I exist. Earl and Paula moved into their apartment 3 weeks ago. It's in a cheaper part of town, and according to Colton, it's pretty grim compared to the house. 1 bathroom, thin walls, parking lot full of beat-up cars. Paula keeps posting inspirational quotes about downsizing and simplifying. Earl has been putting in extra hours at work trying to recover financially. The extended family has mostly stopped talking to me. Helen tried once more to get me to reconsider, and when I said no, she told me I was choosing bitterness over family. Colton is still in touch, but he's the only one. He said Earl's been trying to borrow money from anyone who'll listen, and everyone's saying no because they've learned that lesson. Someone asked me in the comments on my first post if I felt guilty. The answer is no. I don't feel guilty for stopping the subsidization of people who treated me like garbage. I don't feel guilty for enforcing boundaries that should have been obvious from the start. I don't feel guilty for letting them face the natural consequences of decades of poor financial decisions and worse family dynamics. What I feel is free. For 3 years, I lived in that basement and took their abuse because I was building toward this exact moment. I knew eventually they'd push too far and I'd be ready to cut them off completely. The graduation party was that moment. The comments they made were just the excuse I'd been waiting for to execute a plan I'd been building for years. Some of you said I should have just moved out quietly and lived my life, but that wouldn't have accomplished anything. They would have kept living beyond their means and eventually crashed anyway, and they would have blamed me for not helping when they needed it. This way, they know exactly why I'm not helping. This way, there's no ambiguity about cause and effect. They humiliated me in front of 40 people to make Marcus look better by comparison. They used me as the punchline to their joke about success and failure. They took my money while calling me a disappointment. And now they're living in a 2-bedroom apartment trying to figure out how to survive on their actual income while I'm in my nice apartment making 6 figures and planning my future. Earl was right about one thing at that meeting. I will have no family left after this. But here's what he didn't understand. I haven't had a real family for 3 years. What I had was people who used me while pretending I was worthless. Losing that isn't a loss. It's an upgrade. The house sold last week. They got less than they owed, so the bank took the whole amount and they walked away with nothing. Paula posted about closing chapters and new beginnings. Nobody mentioned that I'm the reason they were closing that chapter. Nobody mentioned the graduation party. Nobody mentioned 3 years of financial abuse disguised as family helping family. And that's fine. Let them tell whatever story they need to tell. I know the truth and I'm living with the consequences of my choices just fine. Better than fine, actually. I'm thriving while they're scrambling, and that's exactly what I planned for. To everyone who said I went too far, that family is supposed to forgive, that I should have been the bigger person. I respect your perspective, but it's not mine. Being the bigger person just means letting people keep hurting you while you pretend it doesn't matter. I'm done pretending. I'm done being the punchline. I'm done funding the lives of people who can't stand me. They wanted a winner and a loser. They got what they wanted. I'm just not the loser they expected me to be.